Hey guys, this is Adam again, and today we're back with another ARM templates video. This time, we will be deploying multiple services and orchestrating deployment of those services by defining dependencies and using references. Stay tuned. Let's talk about orchestration using dependencies and references. First of all, this is your tool to define a relationship between your resources so that Resource Manager knows how to create a proper deployment order and target the maximum parallelization so the resources will be created as soon as possible. Well, we already said why, but let's give some examples. Imagine you have a resource group in which you have a storage account and a blob container, and you want to deploy that using ARM. If you would try to create that directly in ARM and not define any dependencies for this deployment, what would happen is that Resource Manager would try to deploy both storage account and the blob container at the same time. And as you can imagine, it will not work. It will actually fail as soon as the blob container deployment starts because the storage account does not exist yet, since the blob container is a child resource and it's part of the storage account service. So what you can do is create dependency. And to do that, you use depends on blocks. And they pretty much read like a sentence. In this case, blob container depends on storage account, which is pretty much your way of saying to Resource Manager that it should deploy storage account before starting deployment of the blob container. And this is how you pretty much do it. But let's talk about a few more examples to get a better grasp of how this works. If you're deploying 4 services, like a storage account with a blob container, an app service which needs to be hosted on app service plan, you can also define those relationships by using depends on blocks. So that blob container is again dependent on storage account and app service is dependent on app service plan. And when this template is submitted for deployment, what will happen is Resource Manager will know it needs to create 4 services, but based on those dependencies, it will create a proper order. Even though resources deploy at a different time, it will know that you need to deploy blob container after storage account and app service after app service plan, and it will ensure maximum parallelization for this job. So far so good, but what would happen if your app service plan would want to pull information from the storage account? You can actually create additional dependencies between those 2 resources. In which case, again, Resource Manager will want to deploy all the services at the same time. It will want to create a storage account and app service plan first because all the other resources are dependent on those 2. But after deployment of the app service plan, it will see that it still cannot start deployment for the app service because app service is still dependent on a storage account. Therefore, after storage account deployment finishes, then the blob container will be provisioned and also then the app service deployment will start. This is pretty much how a tree of dependencies is being created by Resource Manager and ensures proper order of deployment for all the resources. So it is pretty much critical element of every ARM template to properly define depends on blocks for your resources. Now that we know why would you use it, let's talk about how do you actually code it in the ARM templates itself. First of all, let's talk dependencies. So if you have a storage account called my account, you can actually create a container. And to create a container, you specify a type of Microsoft Storage, storage account, blob services, containers, and you need to specify a specific name, my account default input, and the input is the name of the container. And in order to make sure that this container deploys after the storage account, you need to create depends on block, where you're gonna refer to the resource that you're waiting for by either typing its name, using parameter with its name, or by just using resource ID. And the resource ID is a function that allows you to return a fully qualified identifier for the storage account to ensure no ambiguity between the resource names in your function. This is very important if you would name multiple resources in a single template using the same name, but we're gonna get to that later on. Second of all, there's something called child resources. So you have this template which deploys storage account and a container. One thing to note is that there are some services that cannot exist outside of the context of their parent resource. For instance, storage account and a container. You cannot create container without having storage account. You cannot create an virtual machine extension without having virtual machine. So it makes sense. What you can do with those child resources is put them in a nested resource section of your parent resource. And mostly the only reason to do that is to clean the template. because you can actually remove those sections. You can remove the type part, which says Microsoft storage accounts, and you can remove part from the name, which says my account, because those are already defined on a parent resource, making your template much readable. But remember one thing, the depends on block needs to stay, because child resources are not dependent on their parent by default, so you always need to define that block anyway. And using depends on blocks is pretty much so-called explicit dependency, but you can also use implicit. And to use implicit, you use reference function. So during the deployment, you can actually refer to other resources by using reference function to pull some information from that resource during the deployment. And this reference function does pretty much the same job as depends on. One thing to note here is that if you created implicit dependency, for instance for this web application here, don't put that same web application in the depends on block. You can still use explicit dependencies just for other resources. Don't mix the implicit and the explicit dependencies for the same resource. Lastly, you have list functions. During the deployment, you might want to refer to other resources and pull some information like connection string, keys, SAS tokens, credentials, and many more. You can actually do it by using list functions. And doing that is fairly straightforward. You simply call list keys function, you pass the resource ID of your storage account and provide API version for the storage account, which will return you an object containing primary and secondary key. You can find those objects in the documentation. Once you know this returns an object with the keys, you can refer those in the output to pull the value from the primary key for the storage account. This allows you to bind multiple resources and pull the storage account keys to maybe your web application as a connection string out of the box. So you don't have to do this manual work. You can use ARM templates to create this initial configuration for you. And lastly, let's talk about few watchouts here. First of all, remember about circular dependencies. So if you create resource A that is dependent on resource B, you cannot create dependency between the resource B and A, and it will fail during deployment if you try to. So you always need to think about it when deploying resources in your ARM templates. Second of all, a child resources should always be dependent on the parent, because as I said, there's no default dependency between them. And when you're already creating those dependencies, you should always prefer using reference ID over just name, because if you do that, you might always find yourself having ambiguity in your templates and they will fail before the deployment happens, and it's very hard to later find out what's wrong and where exactly did you reference that. And I will show that example during the demos. And remember, depends on blocks are explicit. If you're using reference function, this is implicit, but both work the same way. They are both dependencies between resources. And important thing is, don't mix those two for the same resource that is already defined. And lastly, if you have a resource that is dependent, let's say A on B and then B on C, so it's like a child parent, then make sure not to create that C, which is the grandchild, relationship to the parent A. And that's pretty much it when it comes to watchouts when defining dependencies. We can now move to the demos. And the demos that I have for you today are, first of all, deploying storage account and containers, then creating a child resources. This is pretty much what we've been discussing, and then visualizing ARM templates using Visual Studio Code extensions. And I'm gonna expand on this example by adding web application and pulling storage account as a connection string to this web application, which is all that we've been discussing today as a live demo. So let's go to the portal. Most of the work that we're doing today is in Visual Studio Code. So in the portal, just make sure that you have this as a pinned tile, so it's faster for you to perform these exercises. And in the Visual Studio Code, I'm gonna create a new file called arm.json, where I'm gonna be creating my template today. Of course, I'm gonna use snippet and change the date for the template. And to help myself out, I'm gonna pull a short parameter section. So I'm gonna pull one more parameter, storage account name, and I'm gonna already pull the created previously resource for the storage account. So we don't start from nothing, but since I want to create a dependent resource, I'm gonna create a container now. So let's create container by hand. First of all, let's type, then type storage container. This is the fourth one. And as you see, Microsoft storage account, blob services container. Let's pull the API version and let's grab the latest. Let's give it a name. And the name for the child resource is a specific. So in this case, it's the name of the parent resource / default / name of the container. So in which case we have a parameter. So we need to create an expression. So we need to concatenate the parameter. In this case is storage account name with /default/ and the name of the container, which in case, let's call it input. This will create an input container within the storage account. And this is pretty much how it knows to which storage account to do it. And right now we could probably deploy it, but if you would deploy it right now, it would fail. So what you really need to do is create this depends on block. So let's create it. As I said, it's an array because you can create more than one dependency. And we just specify expression, parameters, and provide a parameter name. This will pretty much put the name of the storage account as a dependency here. If this works, we can actually go back to our portal, go to the template deployment, create new deployment from our template, provide the current template, create new resource group arm01, hit OK, and give a name to our storage account, amdemo_store123a. I agree to the terms and hit purchase, and let's wait. The deployment is done. We can actually go to the resource, refresh the resource group. It will take a second to pick it up. After it appears, go to the storage account itself, go to containers. So this works. So let's review what happened. We created a child resource, although we didn't put it in a child resource section yet. We concatenated the name of the parent resource with the default naming convention for the container, and we created dependency. If we would go to our bell and review the template and go to the template deployment, notice that there are two deployments and one went after another. And this order is pretty much defined by those references that you did. Let me show you something interesting. If you have an extension ARM template viewer, you can actually in the templates press F1 and type ARM viewer to preview your template graphically. And if there are dependencies defined, you will see those arrows connected between the resources. It's very easy visually to validate dependencies between your resources. So it's always a good tool because visually it's easier to review than it is to review the JSON file. So let's close this for now. I highly recommend this extension. I like using it myself. Alright, so for the next demo, let's actually put this resource into child resources section. To do that, we need to define new resources section. This is an array, and simply copy paste the current resource into this section. And as I said, when you define a child resource, you can clean up your template a bit. Because you already defined the type for your parent, as you see it's highlighted, you can remove that part from the child. And you can do the same with the name of the storage account. You don't even have to use the concatenation anymore, so you can get much cleaner results. So let's remove all that, and this pretty much is the same template. So let's change this to output and deploy that template again. So let's go back to our template, to the portal, template deployment, hit new, build from editor, let's save, create new template deployment 02, and amdemo store123b, hit save and run it. And as the storage account deployed, we go to the container section and find ourselves an output container. And as we can agree that this is much more readable than the previous example. And for the next demo, let's deploy a web application with app service plan which will host this web application. To do that, let's add two more parameters. I'm just gonna quickly copy paste two more parameters, and they will be called plan name and the web app name. This is the name of the app service plan and the name of the app service itself. Now I'm just gonna quickly add two more resources. First one will be a server farm. Let me just show you how this looks. This is a type of Microsoft.web server farms and is passing the name as the parameter, the plan name, location, the resource group location, and the SKU for our server farm, which is S1, standard one. Now we can create another resource. In this case, it's gonna be a website. I'm just gonna add this very quickly and notice this. First of all, it's Microsoft.web/sites. Since this is not a subservice of a server farm, you cannot put it as a child resource, but you still need to create dependency. So notice that we are creating right now a website. We're passing a parameter name as the name of that website, but we're still creating depends on and passing the parameter name for that plan above, because that plan needs to be created first in order for us to host a website on this subservice plan. And additionally, one of the properties that you need to provide is the server farm ID. And as you can imagine, without this depends on block, it would fail because that server farm would not exist during the deployment. So let's grab this template and deploy this in the portal. Let's go to template deployment. Let's build from editor. Let's create new resource group 03. And let's call AM demo store 124A. Let's call the plan 124A plan. And the last one, let's call it web. Let's hit agree, let's hit purchase, and wait for the deployment. After about half a minute, everything provisioned just fine. So as you see, we have a storage account. If we go there, we're gonna find our container as we expected. We have app service, which is hosted on this app service plan. We can go to app service plan to find it in the apps section. So everything went just fine. So let's do one more demo. In this one, I will go to app service, and in here you have a configuration. In this configuration section, what I want to do is during the deployment, add a new application setting here, just like that, to add a connection string to that storage account that we're just deploying. So let's go to the template and start working on that. To do that, we need to add one more property in the properties section called site config. And inside of this is an object. There's another property called app settings. App settings is an array, so let's create it. And it's an array of objects, which each has a name and a value. So let's call it storage access key. So we're gonna pull a storage account key, and let's paste the value, which in our case will be an expression. And in this expression, what we're gonna do is call this list function that we were talking about. So let's call list keys. And to list keys, we need to provide two things. We need to provide the parameters and provide the name of the storage account. Additionally, we need to provide a version. So the version of the API that we're referring to. In this case, it's 2019-0601. You can pretty much pull it from the storage account above if you want. It's pretty much the same API version. As you remember, this function will return an object called keys. And this is an array with two properties. So we need to grab the first one and grab the value out of it. So right now this will pull during the deployment from our storage account the keys and grab the first key and put it as a variable. One thing to note is that since we are currently grabbing information from the storage account, we need to add another depends on section. So we need this time to also grab the parameters and then pass the storage account name. And we need to do that because we need to be sure that the storage account will be deployed first. So let's grab this template and again go to the portal. Go to the deployment and build your own template. Let's paste it in. Let's hit save. Create new resource group arm04. And I want to show you something very important. If you were to define AM demo store 125A and paste it 3 times. So you want to have the same storage account name, plan name, and web app name, which is fine. What will happen during the deployment? If I'm gonna hit I agree and hit purchase, I'm gonna get an error during validation because it will tell me that we have 3 resources with the same name, which is ambiguous because template cannot recognize which one should it use. And the reason for that is because what template does here is replacing those parameters here. So replacing this name, this depends on here, this depends on here, this depends on here, and also here, and as you can imagine, everywhere. And now it has this template. And it's like, depends on this resource. I'm not sure which one. And this is what is currently happening. So before we run this very last template, let's fix it with some good practices. To fix it, what you need to do is start using resource ID functions instead of just parameter names. Okay, so let's get to it. Let's use resource ID function, and it has two parameters. Second one is parameter name, so we can already paste it in. And the first one is the name of the resource, but this time this name is the name of the resource type. So just paste it here, Microsoft storage accounts, and pass the parameter. Now it knows really which parameter did you mean. So let's grab this section really quick, and let's go to other dependencies to fix it. We have also dependencies here, so let's grab it. And first one is the plan name, since we know the plan name is of the type Microsoft Web Form. So let's paste it here, and let's close this. And also do the same here. And also let's close it at the end. And change the type. Since we're referring to the storage account, we need to grab the type of the storage account. Paste it here. And lastly, you also need to do it here because you are referencing also using the list count function. Okay, so resource ID, since this is also a storage account, paste it here. Parameters. This section got quite long, so I'm just going to hide this. And let's close it here. So right now we have list keys from the resource ID, a full name and a type for the resource, version, keys, and value. If we fixed everything, this should be working just fine. So let's test it. Let's go back to the portal. Let's close this window. Let's edit the template. Let's paste the new fixed template. Let's leave the same parameters. Hit I agree. And let's hit purchase. Once all the deployment is done, we can actually go to the app service. Again, go to the configuration. And in here, we're gonna find a storage access key. And if we're gonna review the value, this is the account key for entire storage account. This is how easily you can apply initial configuration for your infrastructure in Azure using ARM templates. Now that we know how to orchestrate resource deployment in Azure, we are ready to deploy any kind of solution out there. But that's it for today. If you like the video, hit thumbs up, leave a comment, subscribe if you want to see more, let me know what you think, and definitely see you next time.